14th. It's nice to see such a nice crowd. Everybody seems too loud.
Mike. We put it low down my height.
Yeah, no, that's her height.
Okay.
Anyway, I thought I would share the responsibility this evening, so I'm going to call Gail Saunders to introduce our guest speaker. Thank you, Gail.
Good evening. Out of the blue, last August, I received an email from Claire Simpson, who advised me that she had written a book about Neville Chamberlain in the Bahamas. Of course, I was very interested, as I had read some of the Chamberlain papers at the University of Birmingham when I was researching for my doctoral thesis. I suggested almost immediately that she speak to the Bahamas Historical Society, and she replied that she might be able to do that. I then contacted Jim Lawler, our president, with the news, and he was delighted that Claire had agreed to come to the Bahamas at her own expense and speak to us. He was also pleased that Claire and her husband Rick would visit Harbour Island. You know that for the Alburys and the Lawlers, that is a haven. So they are going to visit Harbour Island for a few days. Claire and Rick Simpson had lived on Andros for a brief period, well, 3.5 years, where they met Cindy Hirsch and Grace Turner, and learned that Neville Chamberlain, later Prime Minister of Great Britain, had spent 7 years in the Bahamas supervising his father's sisal plantation near Mastic Point. Claire called the Bells Island instead of the saga of the Chamberlain sisal plantation, which she preferred, but after, she would probably tell you this, I'm hoping I'm not stealing her thunder, after being dissuaded by one publisher that her original title would not interest readers. The Bahamas Historical Society is delighted tonight to present Claire Simpson to speak to us about Neville Chamberlain and the sisal plantation on Andros. Just a little background, Claire and her husband Rick have 2 married daughters and 5 grandsons. They usually live in Great Britain, but have spent some years living between Florida and the Bahamas. Claire.
Anyway, thank you, Gail. Thank you. I have to say, before I left the Bahamas, I was told that if you leave with sand in your shoes and $1 in your pocket, you will return to the island. I have to say, a surprising amount of sand came home with us, and we hang sand dollars on our for Christmas decorations. Returning the sand will be a bit difficult, but my husband Rick, who is my capable assistant, and I were delighted to be invited to come back and tell the story of Neville's Island. Can you all right? No? Ah, that better?
Yes.
That's better, great, fine. I won't start again. Anyway, the story came about a number of coincidences. It could be said our visit today is one of those, and it's exactly 23 years since we were last in Nassau, when Rick took up the appointment to be the Royal Naval Liaison Officer attached to Ortec base on Andros in 1990. And I was astonished to discover that on our second visit to the Bahamas that October, we happened to arrive 100 years later than Neville Chamberlain and his brother Austin. Their quest was somewhat different than ours. They had been sent by their father, the Right Honourable Joseph. Whilst, as Gail was urging, I befriended Cindy Hirsch on the island, she was studying the history of the island, and through her I also met Grace Turner, and discovered all the information relating to the Chamberlain sisal plantation was stored in the Special Collection Archives in the University of Birmingham, England. 3 years after we returned to Britain, Rick took up a post to teach mathematics at the King Edward School, Edgbaston, which is situated opposite the university. And the chief master of the school, Hugh Wright, very kindly obtained a pass for the special collection, and I was able to start reading my way through the Chamberlain papers. I wasn't sure quite how much you know about the Chamberlain family, so I produced this family tree. The Chamberlains were a very prominent Birmingham family and lived in a very fine house called Highbury Hall, which now belongs to the Birmingham City Council. Joseph had tragedies in his married life. Two of his wives died in childbirth. Austin's mother died shortly after he was born, and Neville's mother suffered the same fate, giving birth to a stillborn baby. Joseph's third wife, Mary Endicott, who was younger than his daughter Beatrice, was the daughter of the US Secretary of State for War. The family were prolific letter writers. In December 1896, Beatrix asked Neville to bring their letters back to England, as in after years it would probably be interesting to get a glimpse into a period of one's earlier life. How right she was. The letters are not only an insight into life in the Bahamas at the turn of the 19th century, but also at home in Britain. I found the story so fascinating that I felt it should be shared with others, and the result was Neville's Island. I was particularly fortunate in contacting Neville's grandson, Francis, who discovered the photographs Neville and his brother Austin had taken in his mother's attic. He kindly gave me permission to use some of the photographs, which are annotated by Neville himself in the book, and also for this talk this evening. Since writing the book, Neville's plantation managers, James Knowles' grandson, Peter, and his wife, Gwen, contacted me, and they were able to tell me the fate of the Knowles children and sent me photographs. I've also used some of those for this evening's talk. What is no longer a little known fact, but for me and many others, it was that Neville Chamberlain, from the age of 21, spent 7 years living in the Bahamas. I've read a number of books about Neville's life and noticed that biographers tend to gloss over this period as one of financial disaster, which it was. However, having lived on the island and by reading the family's letters, I was able to glean a better picture of his day-to-day life and what this remarkable young man was able to accomplish. After the declaration of World War II, Winston Churchill was invited to Neville Chamberlain, who was then the Prime Minister, and his wife Annie. During the course of the evening, Neville recounted his exploits in the Bahamas. Winston was astonished at the tale and said he could not help thinking what a pity it was that, and I will quote here, Hitler did not know when he met this sober English politician with his umbrella at Berchtesgaden, Gottersburg and Munich. He was actually talking to a hard-bitten pioneer from the outer marches of the British Empire. The reason Neville ended up living on Andros Island was a result of his father, the Right Honourable Joseph Chamberlain, visit to America with Mary and his elder children Beatrice and Austin, and deciding to extend the family's travels to Canada, a decision that was to make a dramatic change in young Neville's life and the fortunes of the Chamberlain family. It so happened that Sir Ambrose Shea, the governor of the Bahamas, who had previously been a manufacturer in Newfoundland handling Manila hemp, was staying in the same hotel. This was a happy coincidence for Sir Ambrose, who sought out Joseph Chamberlain. So happened that when Sir Ambrose took up his appointment in the Bahamas in October 1887, he found the islands in what he described as a state of intensified deadness. He discovered that sisal, a type of hemp used for making rope, allegedly grew plentifully in the Bahamas, and realized this could be a suitable crop to alleviate the extreme poverty in which so many of the islanders lived. You're probably familiar with the plant, which still grows wild on Andros, and no doubt on the other islands. Hemp originated in Sisal, Yucatan, where it had been successfully cultivated for nearly 50 years. This photograph, we just discovered this evening where this comes from, but it was one sent to me by Peter and Gwen Knowles, of sisal being loaded into a ship. This was the end product they were hoping for. Anyway, Sir Ambrose managed to convince Joseph Chamberlain this Bahamian gold mine might improve the fortunes of the inhabitants of the Bahamian Islands, so Joseph decided to look into the possibility of staking a considerable portion of the family's fortune in a sisal plantation. Out of the blue, Neville received a summons from his father to come to New York, and so left for the Bahamas with his half-brother Austin on the 25th of October, 1890. On arrival, the brothers stayed at Government House with Sir Ambrose and Lady Shea, and from there they carried out research into Sizewell and travelled around the Out Islands searching for a suitable site for the plantation. As you can imagine, the arrival of two young, handsome, eligible English gentlemen caused quite a stir amongst the society matrons of Nassau, and according to Lady Shea, their arrival had quite a social revolution. The brothers were to find themselves busily engaged in doing their duty to society, which appeared much in awe of them, and were horribly frightened of transgressing some little point of etiquette about which the brothers might learn. The people here in this room who are descendants of those who extended hospitality to the brothers. Very kindly, he's been sending us copies of the History Society's newsletters, and I was particularly interested in Ron Lightburn, I don't know if he's here this evening, photograph of a tennis court in the November edition, because it's quite possible that Neville might have played on this tennis court. He seemed to play a lot of tennis. Captain Lightburn, who owned a Sizewell plantation on New Providence, was a harbour master during Neville's time in the Bahamas, and I wonder whether Ron might be a descendant of this gentleman. As for the brothers, they had work to do and were soon engaged on exploring the Out Islands for suitable sites for plantation. Firstly, they visited the islands of Abaco. Well, you're all familiar with the islands of the Bahamas, but in case you don't have Abaco, Rick will show you. Mr. Gurdon, the governor's private secretary, accompanied the brothers on their voyage. Sailing craft being the main means of transport, they hired a cutter called the Bonnie from Mrs. Darling. Unfortunately, this proved to be a far from bonny experience, and at one point they ended up with an uncommon occurrence in those days in the shallow waters of the Bahamian. And in fact, Neville even took a photograph of the occasion. Poor Austin had been very seasick. At Plum Creek, they visited Monroe's Head plantation, where the manager, Mr. Trumbull, greeted them, and also Mr. Russell's plantation. Mrs. Darling may have been aware of her vessel's shortcomings because she didn't require any, she refused to take any recompense for their using it. In December, they set out again on a prospecting tour of the southern Out Islands, and on this occasion, the governor's assistant private secretary, Sir A. Pollen, who owned a small plantation on New Providence, accompanied them. They hired a fine 70-ton schooner called Sarah Douglas, which proved a more comfortable experience. Their first call was Matthew Town on Great Iguana, where they stayed with Mr. Sargent, the local justice of the peace. They found the soil and plants very poor at Admiral Fane's plantation, which was managed by Mr. Barbs. And they also interviewed Mr. Taylor, the deputy surveyor. Their next intended port of call was Lantern Head Harbour, but for some reason they ended up at Lantern Head Creek. From there they set sail for Abraham's Bay, Mayaguana. This is a picture of a horse, Neville on a horse, at Horse Pond Bay, Mayaguana. During their visit, they took some time off to go on a series of unsuccessful flamingo hunts, ending up at Horseshoe Bay. I've included the photograph of the flamingo hunters. That's not quite, I don't know how. You can just see them in this photograph. They visited Clarence Town to stock up on provisions before setting up for Rum Key on Long Island, where they visited a plantation belonging to the magistrate, Mr. Dorset. They returned to Nassau, and the brothers spent Christmas at Government House, where the Shays butler threw open the wine cellars and set a welcome example to his fellow servants by getting drunk at his master's expense. The brothers found Christmas in the Bahamas quite a noisy celebration. Neville was soon to discover when living on Andros, when at Christmas, birthdays or any other festive occasion celebrated domestic band would perform. On New Year's Eve, the annual ball was held at Government House, which Neville considered a trial. Whilst on New Providence, they visited the Reverend Robert Dunlop, who owned plantations at Carmichael Village and behind Fort Charlotte, Mr. Johnson's plantation, and he lent them his petroleum launch called the Dawn to travel to the last of the islands they visited, which was North Andros Island. Their journey to the island proved to be somewhat perilous, and their destination was Conch Sound to visit Dr. Alexander Keith's plantation. The doctor thought it might actually make a more successful health resort than the plantation. I think he was a bit before his time with that. And it was managed by his son, Alex. They explored the Rand around Nicholstown and Morgan's Bluff without finding any that would be suitable. And they motored down to Fresh Creek, where we would end up living 100 years later, where they stayed with the headman, Mr. Brayman, and his mother, Mrs. Coakley. They explored the creek, then motored down the North Bight. However, Austin decided that North Andros would not be suitable for their plantations, so they returned to Nassau to discover that Lady Shea had organised a dance in their honour. Before they left the Bahamas, they visited Mr. and Mrs. Gurdon from the Monroe plantation, Green Turtle Key, who were staying in the country at Aubrey Villas. The brothers, having completed their exploration, returned to England in January. From Joseph's letters, it would appear that he was in two minds as to whether or not to continue with this venture. Poor Neville didn't have a great deal of choice in the matter, because either he took on full time necessary to the management of the experimental venture in the Bahamas, or Joseph would have to secure him a job in a company in England by buying shares at a high premium, without knowing whether they would give any large dividend. So the decision was made to go ahead with the plan and acquire land on which to set up a sizable plantation. So Neville returned to the Bahamas in May 1891 and once more stayed in Nassau with the hospitable Shays. After the brothers' initial visit, Maguana was sought to offer the most suitable location. Sir Ambrose was hoping they would select a site on Grand Bahama. However, Lord Lennox Forsyth, who was the British Commissioner on Andros, had heard of a large tract of land on North Andros worth taking a look at, which the brothers must have missed on their first visit. Once more Neville borrowed Mrs. means of transport, and he set out with Forsyth and James, who was known as Jim Knowles, who was at the time manager of his uncle, J.S. Johnson's pineapple plantation on New Providence. He was to be employed as Neville's manager. Knowles was the son of Captain Samuel and Catherine Dorset Knowles of Harbour Island. He and his wife Nina Aubrey also came from Harbour Island, and both families were seafaring as well as plantation owners. And this is a photograph which the family sent me of Knowles. Their destination was Nicholstown on the northern tip of the island, and after a nearly disastrous venture into the hinterland, emerging at the back of Nicholstown, Mastic Point was eventually chosen as the site for the plantation. They had a terrible journey back to Nassau, one of many sea voyages Neville was to endure during the next 6 years. He arranged for an agreement with Sir Ambrose for a purchase of 20,000 acres of land at Mastic Point. This map shows the extent of the plantation. Neville then faced with the task of setting up the plantation, employing the workforce, clearing the ground of trees and scrub, buying and planting sisal, arranging for the building of a barracks for the workforce, bungalows for himself and the Knowles family. Initially, Neville had a certain amount of problems with the workforce, because the Andros folk he employed were not used to the work ethic and found it hard to adapt to the discipline of daily work. He was never quite sure how many would turn up, and when they did, they objected to having to work the whole day. After 3 days, they were so filled with astonishment at the amount of hard labour they had undergone, they considered they needed several days to recover. He also provided them with cutlass, a very valuable tool, which some took and failed to return to work. However, eventually he overcame most of the problems. In fact, latterly was almost overwhelmed by people ceasing employment. He often worked alongside his employers. This is a photograph of Adrian Roll, one of his foremen, and it shows the sisal growing and the kind of terrain that they were actually dealing with. The workforce showed proper concern to the cheeky Charnies. I don't know if you've come across those creatures in Nassau, where they were said to nest in the trees being felled. They became greatly excited about one which was described as being green and purple, and no one would go within 100 yards of the tree. Neville feared it was wholly imagination, as no one saw so much as its tail, and after much difficulty, Knowles persuaded 2 men to fell the tree. The people were astonished. The men were not immediately struck dead, and concluded that the creature had left and gone out the back door. We brought Chick Charnies home with us. We bought one that's carved by Henry Wallace from Red Bays, and it keeps watch by our front door to deter unwanted visitors. So far it has been successful. In November 1891, Neville was able to move into his bungalow, which he called Mastic House. It wasn't quite finished, but it was a great improvement on the uncomfortable lodgings he'd been occupying. It was some time before he was able to enjoy the comfortable surroundings shown in this photograph of his sitting room, which was taken in 1895. He also purchased a bloodhound from Cuba as a guard dog and called him Don Juan. There were piazzas round the bungalows, and in this photograph there's Alex, his nearest neighbour from Conchtown, Knowles, Forsyth, can be seen relaxing on Neville's piazza. Mr. and Mrs. Knowles and their children, Carrie, Nina, Kenneth and Nan, arrived in December to take up residence in their bungalow. A later addition to the family was called Arthur Neville, father of Peter, who's seen in this with his mother in this photograph. Neville was rather concerned that Mrs. Knowles wished to take care of him. She actually undertook to clean his socks. And this pleased the family because they thought that they were constantly worrying that he wasn't looking after himself. Communication was by letter via Nassau and New York, which took considerable time. However, a telegraph cable was laid from Jupiter in Florida to Nassau in 1891, and the connection was made in February 1892. This improved communication, however, in order to send a cable, Neville still had to go to Nassau. In July 1891, Neville had a sailing boat built. He named her the Beatrice, after his half-sister, and he learnt how to sail. It's possible that this is his boat, which is being built by Obadiah and Felix. Many of the sailing trips involve sailing through the mangrove swamp to Conch Sound to visit Alex Keith, despite the fact these trips invariably met with Mrs. Knowles appears to be wearing her Sunday best complete with hat. As the plantation grew, transportation of goods to and from the island became increasingly difficult, and in 1892 he commissioned Mr. Bethel from Nassau to build a schooner which he called the Pride of Andros. This is the photograph. You got the photograph? Yeah. No, we next need the next photograph, because the next photograph shows the crew wearing their uniforms, which he bought for them in 1894. Neville regularly returned to England during the hot months from June to September, with leaving Knowles in charge. After his first visit home, he returned with his brother Austin. Neville kept him busy in his garden and helping out in the shop. Austin was very popular with the workforce, and they were really very disappointed when he left. The Pride of Andros arrived while Neville was staying, and much to Neville's eager sail in her when he returned to Nassau to catch the steamer home. This is a photograph of Eden. He was the captain of the Pride of Andros with his wife and Mrs. Roll, who was possibly the wife of Abraham Roll in an earlier photograph. I think the other lady might be the Eden's daughter. The next thing he had struck a wharf, which was quite a saga. Miller, the Surveyor General, was in charge, and work started in June 1892. It took a year to construct. In this photograph of the partly finished wharf, you can see Neville's bungalow, which is on the left, and the Knowles is on the right. Sadly, the wharf was totally destroyed in one of the devastating hurricanes that hit the Bahamas in the 1920s. The shop was a great success. Neville was obviously very concerned for the welfare of his workforce, because he felt it was important that he opened the shop regularly or the people would starve. Beatrix thought it must be a huge affair, catering for so many people's luxuries and necessities. In November 1893, an appropriate name, Mr. Ali Cash, was employed shopkeeper to the Andros Piper Company. On one occasion, the Pride was not able to get back from Nassau with provisions, and the shop ran out of flour, grits and sugar. An old lady came to the shop in the morning, and she bore the news of the lack of the former 2 items without blanching. But when it was revealed there was no sugar, she cried in great alarm, "No sugar? Oh my God!" On 15th of April 1893, a small riot caused great excitement in Nassau. When the West Indian Regiment was removed, a force of constabulary was brought from Barbados, and for some reason there had been ill feeling between them and the natives of Grantstown, who regarded them as foreign intruders. It culminated with an attack on the police station at Grantstown, and a gunboat, HMS Partridge, was cabled for and arrived in Nassau at the beginning of May, and landed a Gatling gun, rather as a warning for use, which calmed things down. The HMS Partridge, she was a pygmy-class composite, which meant she was a sail and steam gunboat, was a fairly frequent visitor to the islands. In October 1893, The Right Honourable Joseph Chamberlain arrived with Austin and Neville to inspect the plantation. They travelled in the SS Niagara and ran into a tremendous gale. They came across a barkentine which was sinking and rescued the crew. Another casualty of the storm was a large ship laden with coal, burnt to the waterline. As you can imagine, Joseph Chamberlain's arrival in Nassau caused quite a stir. They arrived earlier than expected, however, but the town was a mass of flags, and the Executive Council were on the wharf together with about 1,000 people to greet the party. The square was decked out with flags, and a platform had been erected in the middle, apparently for band. The Fire Brigade believed to have escorted them to a government house. The Fire Brigade had the band. But they were spared this by the unexpected of their arrival, and they only had to receive a deputation and an address that morning. They stayed overnight at Government House and set off for Andros the following day in Captain Clapp's new steam launch, the Richmond. She drew too much water to enter the reef, and they endured a rough passage and did not arrive till nearly sunset. The Pride was waiting as instructed, but had obviously decided they were not coming, and to their horror proceeded. Launch blew its whistles and hoisted flags, and eventually managed to attract the... And she started to tack back too windy, and by then the sun had set, so they had to abort the plan. The Pride anchored for the night, and whilst they slowly steamed back towards Nassau, Neville described the situation as sufficiently provoking. They spent a very uncomfortable night, and they had no clothes except those they were wearing, for Austin was... They made a rendezvous the next morning, and a large crowd awaited them on the wharf and shouted and waved their hats and let off guns and generally behaved as they were rather glad to see them. Unfortunately, Joseph was not very well during the visit. However, he was able to undertake some excursions and also sit on Neville's piazza, this photograph here with Austin. They went to the end of the field and ascended what's described as the mountain. I don't think there are very many mountains on Andros. Joseph was most impressed by the extent of the plantation. They sailed to Nicholstown in the Pride and consumed coconuts and grapefruit at Forsyth in the mission house. Joseph realised the time had come to start building a railway and investing in the machinery to process the fibre. So arrangements were made for Neville to visit Cuba, and Noel was accompanied by Alex to Yucatan to find out more about the product they were growing. Before he left America, Joseph arranged for a small, light, shining wagon on 2 wheels to be sent to the island. It was to carry 2 persons, and he hoped it would be suitable for Neville's work. Neville had already purchased freebies on which to survey work on the plantation. When the wagon arrived, one of the horses was eventually persuaded to pull it. Neville kept a diary while in Cuba, where he stayed with a college friend of Theodore Brooks. Sugar was there, but there was something able to get about railways and machinery. Neville's task was to prepare the foundations for the rail growing plantation. This photograph gives an extent of the plantation in 1893. To remove the rubble from the railway, he bought some wheelbarrows. The labourers were thrilled with these modern appliances and said, "We're equal to England now. Where we see wheelbarrows, then you know the business is genuine." To which Neville remarked he thought that the wheelbarrow, being considered the last extremity of civilization, was distinctly humorous. He had already introduced the workforce. I remember there weren't any wheeled vehicles on Andros at this time. He'd already introduced the workforce to the concept of wheeled vehicles with a hand barrow, which is shown in this photograph, to remove stones for the road. All 2.5 miles from the first, and as far as I am aware, the only Andros Railway, was finally completed on the 8th of May, 1895. I was astonished to discover recently that my eldest daughter's mother-in-law's father, Ernest Moore, from 1950 to 52, was a project manager at Roxham South Eleuthera and on Andros, working with Lord Traralgon, responsible for building roads from Fresh Creek. The one domestic point was probably built on the foundations of the railway. Tragedy hit the plantation in 1994, where Mrs. Knowles died giving birth to her 6th child. The baby also did not survive. It cannot be an easy life for her, living away from friends and relations, influenced and greatly missed by all those involved with the plantation. Amongst the photographs her family sent was this one of her gravestone in Nassau. To add to the tragedy, most of Neville's workforce were ill when a brigantine called the Trias, transporting the rails, trucks and some coal from Wales, arrived at Morgan's Bluff near Nicholstown, and Neville had a desperate job relocating the cargo to Mastic Point by sea. In this photograph of the Bay Horse on the railway, the inscription on the switch reads Prias, Nassau, number 51. Or you look at photographs with the magnifying glass, it's amazing what you notice. To add to Neville's problems, the engine and boiler arrived before the building to house them had been constructed. He let the engine house and associated buildings near an ocean hole as a water supply. This indicates it was tidal and likely to contain brackish water. Once production started, this proved to be a disastrous decision as the brackish water of the ocean hole discoloured the fibre. This is a photo of Uncle Charlie's Blue Hole near San Andros. It is tidal and we used to occasionally swim there. I think it's probably too far from Mastic Point to be the one Neville used. In the middle of this confusion, a young man from Birmingham called Eustace Brown arrived to help in the plantation. This was not a good time for him to arrive, and sadly it was not a great success. His replacement was called Garland, who arrived as the plantation was facing disaster. On the whole, life was quite lonely for Neville, as those with whom he had something in common were scattered round the Out Islands or were based in Nassau. He found a kindred spirit in Alfred Greenwood, who was Sir A. Pollen's replacement as the government's private secretary, and they became good friends. As the plantation grew, visitors regularly appeared, which was often inconvenient. The visitors Neville found particularly difficult were reverend gentlemen. On one occasion he complained 2 Roman Catholic priests, 1 member of the Wesleyans, and an Anglican reverend from Fresh Creek arrived in quick succession. The one reverend he happily tolerated was the Matthews. They became good friends. However, Matthew's report to Archdeacon Wakefield throws some light on the reverend gentleman's mission. He walked to Cedar Place. New houses springing up by the dozen everywhere, fine roads in all directions, 2 dog carts, 4 horses and a railway being laid 7 miles into the forest, and a long jetty stretching out into deep water. If only we could get to work there, we have everything in our hands. Neville's other achievements on the plantation were acting as a doctor and a magistrate. As early as 1893, there were unpleasant rumours that the sisal plant threw up was described as a pole or flowering stem. This photograph does actually show some of the sisal growing. Also, numerous small buds. This was 7 years after planting and subsequently withered and died, thus only giving 3 years of cutting. If this were true, it would knock a very large percentage off their profits. People felt it would be wise to stop cutting at 3,000 acres. In 1895, Neville wrote to Austin outlining his fears for the future of the plantation. They were the polling question, fall in the price in the fibre market, the problem of labour, as there might not be enough reliable labour in the colonies to work the leaves should the other prove to be groundless. By far the most serious problem was the plants were not growing. Austin suggested using manure. Neville had located a large cave at the end of the plantation on the south side where guano could be attained, and following Austin's suggestion, he was experimenting it. Sadly, he doesn't give an exact location for the cave, as it might have been one used by Lucayans, though any evidence would sadly be lost. The winter of 1894-95 was extremely and unusually cold worldwide. On Andros, Neville reported that the natural phenomena were remarkable. The sea was an extraordinary bottle green, the sky leaden, fish were dying in hundreds and were cast up on the shore, where they were collected in great quantities by the people for food. Needless to say, this weather badly affected the growth of the plants. However, disaster struck in December 1895, when just after they had started processing the fibre, the baling shed, which is shown in this photograph with their crop hanging out to dry, caught fire. By the time Neville arrived at the scene, the baling shed was one seething furnace. Nothing could be done other than attempt to prevent it from spreading, which they managed to do. After half an hour, the roof fell in, and the walls soon followed, and all the fruits of 6 weeks' labour and the finest house he had were reduced to a small heap of white ash. This was too much for Knowles, who had already suffered the loss of his wife, and he had a nervous breakdown. Before returning to England for the summer of 1896, Neville went on an expedition to explore the west side of Andros with the Reverend Matthews. Sadly, this had to be cut short because Mrs. Matthews was taken ill. Matthews is the gentleman in white in this photograph of corralling sponges at Loggerhead Creek, South Andros. He also revisited the Abaco Islands to see how the plantations there were doing. The largest was the Side Company's plantation on Abaco, which was run by Neil, who can be seen. We need the photograph. It's very capable sister doing. Neil, you can see Neil in this photograph, he's a gentleman. He didn't feel that they were faring any better. He also took a photograph of two members of the prize crew at Joe Creek, or Great Abaco. This came the end of the adventure. But before he left, he received a beautiful letter from the members of the Mastic Point community, thanking them for all that he had done for them. The school, a shop, roads, savings bank, and many other things too numerous to mention. Neville's last letter to the family was from Boston in April 1897, and the letter ended with this ditty, which was a suitable epitome to Neville's 7 years of travels to and fro across the pond. I'm going home, my ship is at the shore. I'm going to back my haversack, I ain't coming back any more. This map shows the proposed extent of the plantation in pink. It's for others to decide whether Joseph had expected too much of his young son. He'd anticipated difficulties in starting up a new industry. He's been successfully overcome in Yucatan, doubted Neville's abilities to do likewise. In the end, they were in the position of having planted 7,000 acres with a plant that could not or would not grow, and they had no choice but to take the consequences and could not expect a miracle in their favour. That sadly was the truth of the matter. The quality of the soil, climate, lack of a suitable water supply, and the value of the end product all appeared to have conspired against them, and they left with valueless land, machinery, buildings and plants. The venture cost the family £50,000, which in today's money would be approximately $7 million. In the spring of 100 years later, in the spring of 1993, members of the Andros branch of the Famous Society visited Mastic Point and explored the site, and we discovered the remains of some buildings near the shore. Also, the remains of a wall, which you can see behind this photo of Cindy Hirsch, and a brick chimney. This was the only evidence we could find of what I now to believe the stone-built kitchen shared by Neville and the Knowles family. There were also a few pieces of timber painted blue and white. The other buildings had disappeared, probably in the hurricanes that hit the Bahamas in the 1920s or eaten by termites. After Knowles died, Neville discovered the family were struggling to support his orphan children. He offered to pay £10 per annum towards their keep. I wanted to discover from Gwen and Peter Knowles what happened to the children, Carrie, Nina, Kenneth, Liam and Arthur. Amongst the Knowles family photographs is this delightful one of the boys at school in Nassau. The children left the Bahamas for the US and Canada between 1908 and 11. Next picture is a family picnic in the Bahamas, which is another family photograph. Peter's father and his uncle Liam started the London winery business in 1926, which became the third largest winery in Canada. The business stayed in the family and was sold in 1996. Peter was only 14 when his father died, and as Gwen said, at that age we neglect to ask all the questions we would ask today. How fortunate that Mr. Chamberlain kept such exact letters. It's almost like he's talking to us. Having followed the young Neville Chamberlain his first visit to the Bahamas through the failure of the enterprise, I was struck by the enthusiasm, dedication and optimism of a young man who devoted 7 years of his early adulthood on a remote island totally devoid of the trappings of civilization which he was accustomed, to the incredible task of creating a sizable plantation under primitive conditions for what is very aptly described as pine barren. The rigours of a public school education put him in good stead. I'm not sure that Rugby were very pleased at that comment. He had knowledge of agriculture, especially in a foreign land with a totally different alien climate. His powers of organisation and administration cannot be faulted. To coerce a collection of undisciplined and uneducated Bahamians into a cohesive workforce was no mean feat. Maybe the Andros venture was just a testing ground, in which less a man would surely have bowed under the weight of such responsibility of hardship. He realized the venture was doomed. Even if it does turn out a failure, I'm not sure I should regret the years I have spent here. The responsibility and independence has certainly called out whatever was in me, and showed me I was worth much more than I thought. Still, it's hard to think of the possibility of so much effort, work and sacrifice of what many would consider the best part of a very young man's life, all going for nothing. I don't know if you have any questions or whether I'll be able to answer them.
How many years did you do research?
Sir?
How many years of research did you have to do?
It took me 2 years to read through the letters, and then as I had no experience of writing books, I wrote it and I rewrote it, and I gave it to my brother to read, who, as I told you earlier, sorted out my appalling grammar. I suppose about 5 years. And then, of course, the problem finding a publisher. I mean, I have no reason to have written a story about Neville Chamberlain other than the fact I happen to share the experience of living on Andros Island, which is why I eventually decided to go for a Kindle. There are some advantages of Kindle and there are a lot of disadvantages of Kindle. I cannot sell you my book today, but I'll tell you how to access it.
Did you, Reverend Matthews, he was an Anglican
He was an Anglican
priest.
Yes.
Did Neville Chamberlain give any other details about him? He's a very interesting man because I've come across some things that he wrote. I mean, he gave great detail in some of his accounts.
He told us quite a lot about Matt, because he had a lot to do with him. You know, he used to visit him. He used to come up to Mastic Point, partly, I suppose, on what I don't know whether because call it a fishing expedition, but you know, it was partly. I mean, it was amazing, as I said, the number of men of Goth who congregated at Mastic Point. When they first met, he upset Neville greatly because Neville was reading Darwin's book on
evolution.
and Matthews made some rather unfortunate comments, and I think Neville was most upset, so he never talked to the man again. However, as I say, then after that they became very good friends, and he had lovely time when he arrived. Matthews arrived with these two small boys, and they'd been to England, and they'd seen all sorts of things they didn't see on Andros.
Was his wife with him too?
Not on that.
No.
I don't think women sort of, well, they came up, we see they were very uncomfortable, which I think women these days, quite happily will travel. But in those days, wearing long frocks and so, it was I think she stayed at home on the whole. Yeah. No, it was very sad that she was ill on that occasion. They were set on this wonderful trip. They were going to go up the was it the north, south, east, but the other side of Andros anyway.
The west side.
What was so amazing was that when they were exploring the sort of hinterland, he had got hold of a map. I have no idea what, but he also, amongst the things in the collection, was an ordnance survey map of that era, which I have to say was mainly sea, but of course most of the islands, a lot of the islands hadn't been really explored at all. And that was very much the case on Andros. It had not, the hinterland had not been explored.
Did he ever come back, or was he troopers, did he?
As far as I know, I think he took his haversack and he didn't come back.
I won't be back.
Did he say much about spending time in Nassau?
Oh, he was. I'm afraid he was very rude about poor Lady Shea. He pulled her leg unmercifully. But oh yes, there were lots of things about Nassau. I'm afraid he didn't. He actually preferred being on Nassau than being, I think the trouble on Andros, he could dress as he liked. When he came to Nassau, he had to dress. There was one occasion when they had a ceremony where they all dressed up in sort of morning coats, and I mean, I just couldn't, how they survived, I don't know.
No air conditioning.
But no, he did say quite a lot about Nassau actually, and I tried to mention quite a lot of the people that he met, because I thought some of you might be reluctant, because the Nassau people were very hospitable. But of course, they were always inviting him to go. He was never quite sure who he ought to invitation from next, without upsetting them. Yeah.
It was very interesting, and I just want to mention two things. You mentioned about the Shea family and their association with Newfoundland.
Yes.
That's still a very prominent family.
Oh, are they?
Yes, who've also served Lieutenant Governor and other positions in the Newfoundland government.
Yes.
So, and that, of course, is the last colony to enter into the Dominion of Canada, Newfoundland, in 1949. Secondly, I read something today very interesting. If you would like to do further research on another Prime Minister, his successor, Winston Churchill.
Yeah.
I read in Churchill's book today that in December 13th, 1931, when Churchill was in New York, I first arrived in that city, out of a car, and not realizing that they were driving on the other side of the road. He went into traffic and was injured very seriously.
Oh, really?
He came to Nassau
Really?
for 2 months and recovered in Nassau. And Jim Lawler's told me a story of a vessel that Churchill saw here that helped in the construction later for the war effort.
Yeah, the Lukai. There was a dredger here, the Lucayan, that had a special front that lifted and
landing craft.
designed, landing craft.
Yeah.
He had them design the Mulberry, which was used on the Normandy beaches in 1944.
Yes.
So we're wondering, in the Churchill family today have a property, part down on Windermere Island. It'd be very interesting to know whether they came to the Bahamas as a result of Churchill's very, very favorable comments about recuperating here. He said that the recuperation in the Bahamas is really what set him back in good health to go forward and be part of all the intense debates during the 30s in England.
Really, I'd never heard that before.
Wouldn't that be nice? We might have the pleasure of having you return with another.
I think one enough for me.
That's in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, if you want to
Oh, is
go
it?
across.
Oh, well, because he frequently goes to Oxford. So,
There
in
you
his
go.
mathematics
That's your job.
group. Yes, so send him down to do some research. Yes, that
Because
yes.
quite interesting, two of the Birmingham members of Parliament, in addition to Neville Chamberlain, at the build-up to the Second World War, were very much aligned with Churchill, and it's a part of Neville Chamberlain's life that's been very heavily biographed, whereas this definitely hasn't. But that would be interesting to discover, and I think we can look at that.
In your research, did you come across where Neville Chamberlain actually was sent by his father when he was a young boy to Green Table Key to get out of the British that were in war someplace else at the time? And they had a house in Green Table Key.
No, that
Yeah. The house is still there. Nobody's living in it. It's a few years from probably destruction itself, but it's still in good enough shape to see what it was all about.
we have more to learn. Yes, sir.
How many years after the bombs did you have this year, and at what age did Churchill?
He was heavily involved in British politics right from 1929 onwards. There was a coalition, just as there is right now, actually, and Neville Chamberlain had a number of positions, including Chancellor of the Exchequer. at that time, but he was not elected leader of the. He was elected leader of the Tory party in the mid-30s. The Tories were not returned as the leading party in the elections until 1937, actually. Yeah. He was Prime Minister for about three years. In the early part of the war, he was still Prime Minister. But then, after the events of the evacuation from Dunkirk and the backs against the wall, a unity government was formed to fight the war, and Churchill was elected as Prime Minister. Because Neville Chamberlain sadly was actually
he was very ill at that stage. He was actually died
at that time.
I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to get this story out was that given was the man coming down off the aeroplane with a piece of paper, say peace in the time. But I mean, I do think of his experiences on Andros must have affected his adult life and the way he saw things and did things. And I think that he realised that Britain was not ready for war, and we needed time. The paper gave us was some time to actually prepare for the inevitable. And, any more questions?
Did he try sisal planting again, or did he go into another business?
Oh, no. It's quite interesting because his brother Austin was the one who was being trained up as the, their father was a very, the family just, did what he was a very authoritative. In fact, there was one occasion, quite amusing, because in one of Neville's letters, he'd actually told his father off for interfering with something, which I thought must be was really quite brave of him, but he was a long way away, so I suppose he could do it. But as I say, Austin was the one who was expected for high things and high places. But the Neville one, they were very. I mean, as I say, they were a very prominent family. I mean, Joseph Chamberlain was very involved in politics in Birmingham. Originally, the family made their money making schools, and I think having made their money, then they could sit back a bit and sort of do what they wanted.
Did this experience of pounds to put them back? They kept their house.
It did mean that.
Did they have to sell?
Joseph was not able to buy some land which he wanted to buy to stop houses being built. But no, it must have. I think yes. I mean, they were quite a wealthy family, but it must have affected their family's finances. I mean, only one of the daughters married. The other two, Neville and his brother Austin, both married. But which is how I came across his grandson. But. It must have been, I think, that was a lot.
But they kept their home.
Oh, they kept their home. They kept their home. Mind you, I must have said the Birmingham County Council is having great difficulty in hanging on to it now, I think.
Is the family still involved in Birmingham?
Some of the family do still live in Birmingham, but there's a Lloyd family. The interesting thing, the various manufacturing families in Birmingham, they all married each other's children. It was interesting, because I suppose to keep the sort of various things going. But the Nettles, I know the Lloyds were another for Birmingham chamber.
Well, the Kenricks, the two Kenricks were the earliest.
The Nettlefields were the ones who had the business with them. And there was one of the Lloyd family that I contacted, who I haven't heard back from actually, who I think Neville, I don't know, he must have had a son or a daughter. He married late in life. In fact, it's quite amusing because his grandfather's son also married late in life, and he had children when I met him.
Who owns the land now? Is the land still owned by the Chamberlains? Has it ever been sold? Or did they lease the land?
Oh, it's been through several. It was bought for, when the trees grew again, of course, it was bought for logging. I think various, he had enormous difficulties selling. I mean, I think he virtually had to give all the rails and all the things that they had, accumulated. But at the same time, I think nearly all the sisal plantations were struggling, and I think it was partly that cold was, and following winter was almost equally cold. I don't know whether you often have winters where the sea almost freezes.
Was that not a Krakatoa winter? Krakatoa.
I don't know what it was. What was it? We did try and work out what it was.
I think
Apparently the Suez Canal froze.
That was about 1908, wasn't it? That was later. Krakatoa, I think.
But there had been one before on the other Indonesian island.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought
It could easily have been some
Yeah,
climatic
yeah.
event. But,
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think the land eventually became property of the Colombian Research Institute. Eventually, the part around the airport was the great food farm.
Mm. But really, I mean, it was a tragic. I felt when I was writing it was a bit like writing a tragic novel. And it was interesting. It did almost seem that when Paul Mills died, that was when things started going downhill. I mean, up until that day, it'd all been going well, and it was almost as though that was the sort of catalyst when things started to go wrong, which was so tragic.
You hear of Mr. Hill? He was the grandfather.
I'm going to have to read your book.
No, Hill isn't mentioned in my book, but he was the grandfather of our first Bohemian Anglican bishop.
Anyway.
Any other questions?
Well, it's been my pleasure. I feel terribly honoured being invited to come and tell you about this. And I hope you've learned something anyway.
Yes.
And maybe you might be able to buy the books and she on a Kindle.
Yeah, I don't have a Kindle, but I'm sure people.
Get on Amazon. You were going to
It's
tell
on
us how to
Amazon.
buy your
It's
book.
Yes.
Amazon. You were going to tell us how to get your book. Amazon.
Amazon.
I very much hope to be able to get some hard copies of it printed, but it's trying to print it, unless you're going to write some bestsellers, they're not interested, you know. It's we'll be able to get us, we were looking into it, yes.
Maybe you can try,
Who?
Yeah, media, yeah.
I
Neil has a
wrote-
way of getting 100 books.
I-
You don't have to pay so much.
I did actually, I don't know if it was him, but I did approach a Bohemian publisher, because I also thought that the tourist company, you know, you could do a Chamberlain tour and sail around all the islands and he sold. Or visit Ambrose Island and see where the, you know, plantation was. But nobody tells us who they are. Well, perhaps you know who they are. Yes?
I have no media publishing.
No.
Neil was telling me, that was the guy, the last speech he got about old books.
Yes.
He told me that you could, you lay your book out, or have somebody lay it out for you.
Yes.
And then they print 100 copies.
Yes, I think exactly.
Yes.
Because we've been, yes.
It's, the problem is that the market is here. The actual, namely us, is in Britain. There's no publisher in Nassau that would do it, I don't think. Certainly in the States.
Media.
Yes,
The actual
It ended up
book
being quite a long book.
is written for an electronic format, so it doesn't exist in publishing format, although we do have something, we could turn it. But the thing that cripples all the time is the cost of postage with regard to the books, because we could, it makes the book so expensive that nobody would buy it. You're suddenly talking about a $20 book, whereas really the book ought to retail rather less than that for what it is.
That's cheap.
Well, yes, it's cheap. It's not an academic.
But to answer Peter, in my newsletter and the reminder, I details of how to get it on Amazon.
Because what I didn't have was about
Yes, on the email.
Oh, okay.
And I've gone, of course, I read it all.
She's given me a little slip with how to order the book. You'll have to get one way from £3.28 to
$7. I just got it on Kindle today. It's $7.
You got it?
On Kindle, it's a $7 download.
A $7 Kindle. Do you know how to do Kindle, Peter?
More or less.
I drive foolishly. I have travelled with my kid left it at the hotel.
Good. Well, thanks very, very much, Glenn.
Thank you.